Welcome, boys and girls. What we're going to do here in lesson 2.4 is we're going to figure out how you can use partial quotients to find the answer to a division problem. Now, this is probably a new concept for many of you, but as we go through these, you're going to start to see that the way that we're going to use these partial quotients, you might find it actually easier than when we use our standard division algorithm. Let's take a look at our first example here. Our first example here is 874 divided by 22. Now, what we would normally do when we would solve this kind of problem here, we would take our steps to long division, we would divide, we would multiply, we would subtract, we would check, and we would bring down. But when we do that, when we use partial quotients, we're not using that standard method of dividing. And I'm going to show you how this actually works out here. Now, when we were doing using our base 10 blocks to show 874, we would take the 800s blocks, we would take 7 tens blocks, and we would take 4 ones blocks to represent 874. But like I told you in class, I don't want you to think of that 874 as separate hundreds, tens, and ones blocks. I want you to try to visualize 874 ones blocks. And what we need to do with 874 ones blocks is create groups of 22. Now, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, how many groups of 22 can we make from the 874 ones blocks that we have? Well, when we use partial quotients, typically what we do is we start out with 10 groups of whatever the divisor is. So the divisor in this instant is 22. So what we're going to do is we're going to take 10 groups of those 22, 10 groups of 22 of that divisor, and we're going to figure out how many blocks we would have used from the 874. Now, the reason why we use 10 to start out of the divisor is typically we are able to do that mentally in our head. We're able to figure out what 10 22s are, because we know that from our past lessons, from our past experience, that 10 22s would equal 220. It's the same thing. It's 22 with a 0 put on the end of it. Alright, so now if I made 10 groups of 22, that means I would have used 220 blocks from the 874 blocks that I have. Now, the next thing you need to do is figure out how many blocks you're going to be left with. In this instance, you'd be left with 654 ones blocks. And like we were doing in class, again, we would ask ourselves if we could make another 10 groups of 22 with the 654 ones blocks that we have. I know 10 groups of 22 equals 220. I have 654 blocks that I'm working with. I could absolutely make another 10 groups of 22. So if I take another 10 groups of 22, now from the 654, I would have to subtract to figure out how many ones blocks I'd be left with. In this instant, I'd be left with 434 ones blocks. Once again, I ask myself, can I make another 10 groups of 22? If I have 434 blocks and 220 of them would be used if I made 10 groups, I certainly can make 10 more groups. So I'm going to subtract 220 once again from the 434 ones blocks that I have, and now I am left with 214 blocks. So far, what I've done is I've made 10 groups of 22 here. I've made 10 groups of 22 here, and I've made 10 groups of 22 here. And that means I've created 30 groups of 22 so far. But I'm not done, because what I have left here is I have 214 blocks left. And I still can make groups of 22. But in this case, I can't make 10 groups of 22 the way I was doing for these previous steps, because 10 groups of 22 is 220. I only have 214 blocks that I'm working with. I could tell that that's very close. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to see how many blocks would be used if I was making 9 groups of 22 instead of 10. 9 groups of 22, I would have to multiply 22 times my 9, and I would get 199. So that's exactly what I'm going to use. I'm going to make 9 more groups of 22, which would get me 199 blocks that I would have used. Now at this point I need to figure out how many blocks I would be left with. I would subtract, I would borrow, subtract, and what I would be left with was 15 blocks. Now, at this point, what I could sell from what I have remaining, from the 15 blocks that I have remaining, I can't even make one group of 22. So what I've done here is I've created a total of 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 9, which gives me 39 groups of 22. And I have 15 that are left over, which means that is my remainder. Therefore, the quotient to 874 divided by 22 is going to be 39 remainder 14. Now, understand that we were using our 10 groups of our divisor, and we continued with that pattern throughout. Now, there's more than one way to get this answer. Many of us were doing that in class. Some of us were figuring out 20 groups of 22, and that's definitely a possibility that you could use. There's more than one way of getting this answer. Let's take a look at another example. Here's another example. We have 742 divided by 36, and we're going to use partial quotients to solve this problem. Now again, what I want you to do is I want you to visualize 742 ones blocks, and what we're doing is we're making groups of 36, and we need to figure out how many groups of 36 we could actually make from the 742 ones blocks. What we do typically when we use partial quotients is we start out by making 10 groups of whatever that divisor is. 10 groups of this 36 I know would be 360 blocks. So if I tried to make 10 groups of 36, that means I would have used 360 blocks from the 742 blocks that I had. Now, how many blocks would I have left? I would have to subtract to figure out how many blocks I would have left. So the answer, if I subtracted 742 minus 360, I would get 382. Now I need to check to see if I have 382 blocks, can I make another 10 groups of 36? 10 groups of 36 equals 360. I have 382 blocks. I could absolutely make another 10 groups of 36. That would give me 360 blocks that I would have used. And now I need to figure out how many blocks I would have left. And what I would be left with is 22 of those ones blocks. At this point I could see I have 22 ones blocks left. I cannot make one group of 36. Therefore, what I'm left with is a total of 20 groups of 36 that I made, and I have a remainder of 22. And that's how you use partial quotients. I'm going to give you one more example. I'm going to write it up, and what I want you to do is I want you to try to solve this one yourself. Okay, so here's the next example. 464 divided by 18. I want you to use partial quotients to try to find the actual quotient. And again, I want you to think of 464 ones blocks, and you have to create groups of 18. The quotient will be how many groups of 18 you actually make from the 464. Go ahead, press that pause button and try to solve this problem. And press the play button once you've solved it to see if you got the correct answer. Okay, so here we have 464 divided by 18. Like we've been doing, typically we start out with 10 groups of this divisor. And if I made 10 groups of 18, that means I would have used 180 ones blocks from the 464 that I started out with. So if I took 180 of those ones blocks away, if I took 180 of those ones blocks away, what I would be left with at this point would be 284 ones blocks. So now I have 284 ones blocks left. Once again, I'm going to ask myself, can I make another 10 groups of 18? 10 groups of 18 is 180. I have 284 blocks that I'm working with. I could absolutely make another 10 groups of 18. So I'm going to record that here on the side, and I'm going to subtract the 180 blocks from the other 10 blocks of 18 that I used, and what I'm now left with is 104 ones blocks. So far I have 10 groups of 18 here, 10 groups of 18 here, which is a total of 20 groups of 18. I have 104 ones blocks left. I could see that I am not able to create another 10 groups of 18 because I only have 104 ones blocks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a number that's obviously less than 10 to figure out how many groups that I could possibly make. So I see 104 is somewhat close to 180. So I'm going to take a number like, let's say, 7. And if I made 7 groups of 18, I want to see how many blocks I would have used. So if I make 7 groups of 18, I multiply 18 times 7, and I would get 126. I could see if I made 7 groups of 18, I would use 126 ones blocks. I only have 104 ones blocks, so that's not going to work out. So let me try another number. Let me try a number like 6 groups. If I made 6 groups of 18, I now would have used 108 ones blocks. I am not able to make 6 groups of 18 because I don't have 108 ones blocks. I have 104 ones blocks. At this point, I could clearly see that it would be 5 groups of 18. Now I just need to figure out what 5 groups of 18 would equal, and I multiply 18 times 5, and I would get my answer of 90. So if I made 5 groups of 18, that means I would have used 90 of those ones blocks. And now at this point, what I'm left with is I'm left with 14 ones blocks. At this point, I could see that I have 14 ones blocks. I cannot make one group of 18. So if you can no longer make any group, any more groups from what you have left, you know that this is going to be your remainder. So I know I'm going to have a remainder of 14, and I could see along the side here that I made 10 groups of 18 here, 10 groups of 18 there, which equals 20 groups, plus I made 5 more groups of 18, and that would equal 25 total groups. And like I said, I have a remainder of 14 there, for the quotient would be 25, remainder 14. Now, I was basically using trial and error to figure out this last group here. You may have started out by taking 2 groups of 18, okay, and then maybe another 2 groups of 18, and you would have to make maybe one more group of 18 in order to get this answer. There's more than one way of using these partial quotients to get these answers, but as long as you understand that the concept behind it and the steps behind it, you actually might find it easier than our standard algorithm method that we use. Hope this clears this up for you, and if you have any questions, make sure you ask me in class.